For the last 5 months, I've been serving as interim Department of Transportation Director for the city of Oakland, California, which is creating a new DOT. And that's a whole other story. But one of the things that that experience has given me is a lot more compassion for my clients. And compassion for your Department of Transportation staff is one of the things that is going to be required from all of you in order to get done the work that needs to get done. So congratulations, Mayor and Council, on winning on the bond. Condolences to your staff that have to actually deliver. This is a huge challenge. Another thing that I want to say about me is that I don't know all that much stuff about transportation. People bring me out really for 4 reasons. One is framing. I see connections, and I can talk about those connections, and I can talk about why we make transportation investments. The second reason is plausible deniability. So if the bond had failed, the mayor would have been able to blame me. That's a very useful skill that I bring. More importantly, the thing that I do is I'm an outsider, and I come and I talk about the stuff that staff already know perfectly well, but I say it as the outsider, and therefore you believe it. And you go on and do the implementation. But really, the primary reason why people bring me out is to shame them in just the right way. And Austin needs a little bit of shame, right? Your problems, to the extent that you have problems, all of your problems are rooted in success, all of them. All of your problems are rooted in your spectacular success. And it's really easy to be a little complacent when things are as great as they are here. It's really easy to want to resist change when things are so good. Many of my clients are some of the best places in the country. And you all have good reason, very good reason to be afraid of change. For the most part, any of you who've been here for any length of time, you've seen a lot of change. And a lot of that change has not made your city better. A lot of that change has not taken your values and carried them further. A lot of that change has not made Austin more about what you love about this place. But guess what? I am from San Francisco. I know what it looks like to resist change. The forces that are upon you, the forces that are resulting from decisions that were made 15 years ago, those cannot be stopped. And if you try to, the consequences are dire. San Francisco, California, I would argue, is no longer creating culture. We are consuming culture. The creation of culture we've delegated to Oakland. That's a whole other lecture. Some of the things that make Austin the rich, awesome place that it is are at risk. And I want to point out to you that not only is there an urgency to deliver on this infrastructure bond, but there is an urgency to make sure that you are very well aware of the changes that are coming and that you steer that energy and adapt to it and be very clear about who exactly you are and make sure that those changes point you in the right direction. But let's get into the presentation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we actually do in transportation and some of the critical things that we need to think about conceptually in order to deliver on this promise of the corridors. We're going to have a little geometry, a little math lesson that's important. We're going to talk about a theme that is about focusing on the short trips, not the long trips. The greatest opportunity here in Austin to allow for greater mobility is to make it easier to not drive for those people who, it might be possible for them not to drive, in order to make it possible to drive for those people who absolutely need to drive. You've got a lot of really, really short trips by car that are getting in the way of the long trips. We'll talk a little bit about transit, a little bit about parking, and then getting quickly to what's next. And I'm going to go through this all really quickly. I apologize that I talk too fast. I am a Yankee. So technology is the solution to all of our problems, right? There's all this new invention that's occurring in our industry. It's going to be completely transformative, and soon we'll all be in our own little bubble pod, going wherever we want to go, and we don't have to worry about any of this traffic congestion stuff, right? Wrong. Everything that we've seen in transportation technology in the last couple of years, all of it dates back to at least the 1930s, and things like Hyperloop were first patented in 1867. And most of the vision that we have of the city of the future that we're still trying to build to was developed for the 1933 World's Fair, the most visited industrial exhibit in the history of the world, were the three Futurama exhibits at the 33, 39, and 64 World's Fairs, called Futurama. And look it up, it's amazing. It was sponsored by the General Motors Corporation in the Great Depression that reimagined America and American cities around the automobile and the promise that there would be a chicken in every pot, a General Motors car in every garage, and that this would deliver unto us unlimited mobility. And it was going to transform society. And indeed, it partly did. The investment in the interstate highway system, at least the portion not in cities, did transform not only physical, but also social mobility in the United States, perhaps one of the best investments we have ever made. But it also had dire, unintended negative consequences. And this vision of unlimited mobility is still with us. So, when you finally can't add any more lanes to I-35, we'll just put cars in the sky, right, like the Jetsons. But even George Jetson recognized that unlimited mobility, this promise of unlimited mobility, is delusion. We're never going to have unlimited free mobility because we've seen what it entails. That congestion is not an infrastructure problem. It's an economic problem. Congestion is simply what happens when the demand for mobility equals the supply. And in a place that's where your problems are rooted in success. Any infrastructure investment, the primary impact of that is to change land value and to change travel behavior. And that congestion is simply the equilibrium point of demand and supply in an economically successful system. So let's go back to start talking about some of the reasons why we invest in transportation and how we need to think about the future of cities. One of the things that the modernists neglected was two fundamental constants, things that have not changed in hundreds of thousands of years. One is the physical needs of the human body. Science is really clear that we need 10,000 steps every single day in order for our bodies to be healthy. You've got to put in your 10,000 steps every day. And if in your city, you're expecting people to drive to the gym and walk on the treadmill to get their 10,000 steps in, like how many? No, we're not doing that. If we do not design cities so that you get your 10,000 steps in every day without thinking about it, and that every single one of those steps is delightful, you are condemning your citizens to an unhealthy life. We dictate lifespan. And in fact, in low-income neighborhoods that are auto-dependent, we knock about 15 years off the life of our citizens. And technology is not helping that. So this vision of the autonomous vehicle future has already been predicted by WALL-E, exactly what the public health outcomes are of that, if everyone can go in their little independent pod door to door and never, ever have to walk. And yet we know that when we design spaces that make walking delightful, that we love that. We are tribal social primates. Nothing interests us more than other humans. We love walking in public spaces and seeing other people, but only if it's designed correctly. And we know, again, the outcomes of not planning for public health. But the other constant, and neuroscience and neuropsychology are increasingly quantifying the factors of human habitat that make us happy. And there's a lot of chemistry around this, and a lot of thinking, and I would urge you all to study the neuropsychology of place. This little thing here is a neuropeptide called oxytocin. And it's the biological basis for trust. All human emotion has a biological basis. This is the trust chemical. And it is released by the body in certain very limited circumstances. So it's released when we gaze longingly into the eyes of somebody we love. It is also, for obvious reasons, released most prominently during breastfeeding and orgasm. But it is also released when we exercise outdoors. And you've all experienced this. You've had a horrible argument with somebody that you love. Things were terrible, you were going to say something you regretted, and you went outside and you went for a run, or you went for a bike ride, or you went for a swim, and suddenly it was all okay again. This was not the world changing. This was your biology changing and reacting to your brain through chemistry. This is oxytocin at work, and if we design our cities around exercise outdoors and social ability, your population will be happier and more trustful. Nate Silver famously wrote that people vote Republican where there are no sidewalks. We also know that when we're stuck in our cars and in traffic, a whole other array of biology comes into play. Our fight and flight instincts get triggered on the road, and we expect social interaction with people. Like, that's what our brains are wired for. And when you're going 50 miles an hour and you've got this big box of steel and glass around you, you don't get the social signal that you need when somebody cuts you off. And instead, your social status and your safety are threatened. And when you don't get the, like, oh, sorry, response that you're expecting, your brain automatically triggers escalation. And the chemistry of the fight or flight response actually creates permanent changes to the brain if you experience this every day. Permanent changes that make you angrier and less trustful, but more importantly, that shut off access to the prefrontal cortex of the brain and make you less capable of thinking through the consequences of your actions. How many of you have done or said something behind the wheel that you would have never, ever done under any other circumstance? Yes, we've all done that. So, what about autonomous vehicles? Aren't they going to solve all of our problems? Well, they're going to solve potentially some really big problems, like the over 30,000 Americans a year who die as a result of human error because we allow people to hurdle at crazy speeds, giant metal death machines, right? It's insane that we even allow this. Urban parking demand effectively goes away. By our calculations, we're estimating that about 80% of urban parking simply gets eliminated, and we're actually already starting to see these trends in cities just as a result of transportation network companies that I'm not allowed to mention. There is a certain amount of greater efficiency that we get because you can cram cars closer together. That's great. And a lot of significant potential for creating access to transit from places that have been transit-proofed, where regular public transit doesn't work. But it's important to recognize that autonomous vehicles will do absolutely nothing to solve our congestion problem. Because again, congestion is an economic, not an infrastructure problem. So we hate congestion. It is exceedingly annoying. We complain. We demand that the roadway gets widened. We raise our taxes. And the roadway gets widened. And driving is faster. It's great. So now, honey, why don't we move to that bigger, cheaper house farther away because we can both get to our jobs in time? So the problem with faster driving is it means that more people drive, which results in congestion, which makes us sad, which makes us say that surely just adding one more lane to Interstate 35, I know it didn't work before, but this time I promise. Just one more lane, and we'll finally have solved that congestion problem. Infrastructure has no impact on congestion. Neither transit infrastructure nor roadway infrastructure. Congestion is an economic problem, not an infrastructure problem. And oh, by the way, another thing to remember about autonomous vehicles is to recognize who is investing in them. So Google didn't make its money off of selling information any more than Airbnb makes its money off of selling hotel rooms. The market for autonomous vehicles recognizes that, let's see, the occupants, the car will have all of their credit card and demographic information. It will know exactly where they are and where they've been. They don't have to pay attention to the roadway. And oh, the inside of this thing, a great venue for screens. The only thing that anyone is going to pay for in the future of mobility is to turn the ads off. It's the Hulu version of mobility, right? Mobility in the future will be free. Mobility in the future eliminates all of the current brakes that we have on induced demand, which is the actual cost, the annoyance factor of sitting in congestion, and the waste of time. Why not live 4 hours away from where you work and sleep on the way? Why not rent the office autonomous vehicle or the bedroom autonomous vehicle? Or let's see also where the internet makes its money. Just imagine the other things that will be offered in autonomous vehicles. So let's start thinking about pointing us towards solutions. The most important aspect about transportation and its relationship with land use is the geometric conundrum. So you've probably seen images like this that show how much roadway space it takes up to transport 60 people in a car versus a bus versus a bicycle, right? It takes up more than 10 times as much space per person to move somebody in a car than in basically any other mode of transportation. Well, guess what? Autonomous vehicles don't change that geometry. So it still takes up as much space to move a person driving alone or as a passenger in an Uber or in their own little autonomous pod. You still have got 200 square feet of space around you. It's great, it's luxurious. But you've got about 6 square feet of space for somebody riding on a bus or a train or walking or on a bike. The math of cities requires that we emphasize the most space-efficient modes of transportation in order to figure how much roadway space do we have and how do we need to allocate that space to move people rather than how do we allocate that space to move cars. The goal of the transportation system is moving people and goods, not moving vehicles. So thinking about the math of cities and relating that to your performance indicators and your corridors is critically important, and we'll get more into that later. And it's important for you to all recognize that unless you are planning on demolishing more Austin neighborhoods in order to widen highways, that simple math requires that you reallocate your limited roadway space for the most space-efficient modes of transportation. This is not because it's greener or better, or people who ride bikes or take the bus are more righteous and holier than people who drive alone. It is simple geometry. The other important thing to think about with your corridors is to not just focus on the street, but focus on adjacent land use context. The best, and I would argue, the only good transportation plan is a good land use plan, right? That should be the starting point. And one of the primary reasons why you're investing in corridors is to help shape and capitalize upon the existing land use advantages that you've got. One interesting place to start is with the location efficiency program. You can go online and look up any place in the country. I just did a little screen capture for Austin here. And one of the things that you can look at there is average housing costs compared against average transportation costs. So this is out near Pflugerville. You can see the cost of housing, cost of transportation, as well as the number of miles driven annually by residents out there compared to downtown Austin. And while downtown Austin may be more expensive than the outer suburbs, you'll notice that the transportation costs get cut in about half, as does the rate of driving. There is no better housing affordability strategy than making sure that your low-income households do not have to drive a lot or own a lot of cars. AAA tells us that it costs a family about $9,000 a year to own a car. You can do a far better job making housing more affordable by allowing households to give up a car. That's a $700 a month rent savings that they gain by being less auto-dependent. This is really incredibly valuable. So your housing affordability strategy, and I know this is an important topic here, has to focus on creating opportunities for affordability that are tied both to transit and to local services. If you're putting affordable housing out in the middle of nowhere, sure, you're reducing the rent on one hand, but you're gouging them on the other through transportation expenses. Don't do it. Focus on your corridors. Another thing that's important to understand is the math of transit. So density drives basically everything about transit success. Density creates the potential market for transit services that allow it to be justified to invest in a frequency at which transit becomes a reasonable choice for people who have choices. So your geography here is really clear, and you're going to see this pattern on the map throughout the whole series of maps that I'm putting forward. There is a part of Austin that works for transit, and then there's a part of Austin that you have made transit-proof, that will never work for transit, and you should not pretend that it does. There's also, so that's the part. There's also a part of Austin where you have employment that is oriented around transit, and that's a much smaller area. Most of your employment has been transit-proofed, largely through land use decisions about siting and parking. So this is the part that works for transit, and a lot of that is driven by your history. So originally Austin, very walkable place because, you know, when the city was founded, there were not cars. People needed to get around by horse and on foot. So you have this really walkable plan that evolved, like many cities, into a series of streetcar suburbs. And this map is basically the map of your corridors. The red lines are the historic streetcar network, and guess what? That is where all of your walkable commercial still is, and where so many of your tremendous opportunities still lie, even back from the commercial zoning maps from the 20s through the 30s. This is walkable Austin, and where you've got the opportunity for dramatic transformation and for rapid mode shift by investing in walking and biking and transit in order to allow these folks to not have to drive, in order to create capacity for those poor stiffs who ended up living in a transit-proof neighborhood that do have to drive. The best way, again, to accommodate those folks who are living in non-transitable places is to let them drive by getting the folks who actually do have a choice out of their cars. There's a gazillion short car trips that should not exist. And you've been through these patterns before. It's amazing looking at the historic photos of Austin and how what wonderful, chaotic places your streets were back long ago, you know, full of horses and people and bikes and streetcars and ladies with big dresses and giant hats wandering around in the middle of the street. It was great. And as we started retrofitting the city for the car, we started making some very good decisions, but also some mistakes. The corridor plan gives you an opportunity for a rebalancing effort. Like, we're not going to go back and turn the city back into what it was in 1925, but we can make a little bit of a sound dial scale of adjustment to make your corridors more walkable and bikeable as they once were. And you've already done all this work. One of the things that's remarkable about Austin is most of your homework is really done. You've done all the policy work. You've done all the community work. You've written plans for every single one of these places. All you have to do is to go out and build. Go out and implement. You're ready here. It's going to be scary and it's going to be traumatic, but you're ready to get stuff done. Another important factor to keep in mind is that walkability also drives transit. If you can't walk to and from the bus or the train stop, that bus and the train ain't going to be effective. So broad-scale walkability investments adjacent to your corridors are also important. And it means not forgetting about really key elements like simple stuff like trees. You know, when it's hot here in the summertime, having shade dramatically increases the walkable distance. And since area, you know, is the square of radius, you get a big multiplier effect in the utility of transit by investing in all of that walkability, including shade improvements. So now let's talk about a little bit about transit on your corridors. So You've got a really good relationship here in the city with Capital Metro. Capital Metro is making the right series of investments, but the next set of investments are going to require a much deeper partnership between the two agencies. So you've done great planning work, and you've recognized already that your corridors are the right places for investment in fast, frequent, and reliable transit. And I put a special emphasis on frequency. You need transit to be really frequent in order for it to be attractive to people who have a choice. If you cut travel time in half, you can double frequency and capacity at no marginal cost, because you turn the buses around more quickly. So looking at all of the delay factors on all of your corridors and working hard to make sure that a bus with 60 people on board never has to stop at a red light in order to let 4 cars with 1 person in each to pass in front of them. Much of your current rules about traffic signal operations focuses on the vehicle, not on the person. So focusing on person delay rather than vehicle delay, and acknowledging that it's not right for a person on board a 40-passenger bus to be valued at 1/40th the value of somebody who's driving alone in a car. Your current level of service rules look at vehicles, not at people. So looking at not only congestion-related delays, but also boarding delays, partnering with Capital Metro to get transit passes in the hands of all of your citizens and to open all doors, not just have people go through the front door, is really important because boarding delay is typically about 1/3 of total delay. It will also be important to think about vehicle types. So transit operations are usually done on a shoestring. We build vehicles to kind of be like tanks. They don't do that in other parts of the world, right? They recognize that being on transit needs to offer the same amenity of driving in your awesome personal car. And so floor-to-ceiling glass and transparency and an attention to detail and human dignity, whether it's on a train as the previous photo or this photo of a bus in Brazil, right? Make your vehicles welcoming to your passengers. Another topic that's going to be important for you to address as you start looking at your corridors is parking. And this is the third rail of many cities. I have a lot of experience. I'm working with our friends here at the Downtown Alliance on downtown parking study here. There are few things more controversial in a city that is changing rapidly than parking. And it oftentimes becomes a flashpoint for unrelated fear of change. So one of the first places that we start in thinking about parking is protecting the existing single-family home neighborhoods that are terrified of change. So residential parking permit districts, which you know about here, are an important tool. But we can refine that tool to draw the boundaries of permit districts around the low-density districts that are not expected to change. Draw a firm boundary for your residential parking permit district at the zoning boundary, and forbid the new development in the areas of change from ever being able to get a residential parking permit to park in front of one of your existing residents. This is anti-market and anti-democratic, but a critical tool to allowing your existing population to feel like they'll be made reasonably safe as the city grows and changes. It is also important to invest in technology. It is always cheaper to invest in technology to help motorists find those existing available empty spots than it is to build new empty spots. So help motorists find parking and take a very customer-oriented approach to your management of parking. Make it easy to find a space. Making it easy to find the space means establishing the right price. So the rules, the laws of supply and demand apply to parking just as they do to any commodity. And the right price for parking is always the lowest price that achieves an availability target of about 15%. The right price for parking is always the lowest price that ensures that a motorist can always find 1 or 2 spaces on every block, in every garage, and in every parking lot. And this is something that we're working on in the downtown plan. It is critical that the city move to promote, and I would argue require, parking be shared. Parking should never be allowed to be bundled into the cost of housing or commercial leases. If you care about housing affordability and business success, let people choose the amount of parking that they want and don't hide the cost of parking into the price of housing. Also, you can, as we've done in many cities in the West Coast, establish minimum requirements for shared parking and maximum allowances for reserved parking. In your corridors, which are thin and narrow, shared parking is really, really important to commercial success. So the restaurant can share parking with the office building next door because they're peaking at different times of the day. This is hard work, but it's going to be essential for your corridors. But the real thing is to pull all of this together and to take a very different collaborative approach with parking that, unlike some of your, North Lamar is a lot like this, where you've got your big corridor and you have land uses that are set apart from the street, and they each have their own parking lot. And a typical trip, and this is much compressed, would involve driving your daughter to school, which requires a parking space to drop her off, and then you go and you drive to work and you park, and then you've got to take her to soccer practice because of course you don't want her running across the horrible, ugly arterial. And then you go and you do some shopping and you pick her up and you go home. And that is not only a lot of parking, but it's a lot of turning movements off of the big arterial, which are resulting in additional congestion. If instead you have your corridor and you have a grid of walkable streets alongside that corridor, and you array your land uses fronted onto the street rather than a parking lot, and then you have them share parking in the back, you can have the same trip where you drive and you park, but you park once, and your daughter can get herself to school while you go to work, and she can now get herself to soccer practice because she doesn't have to cross the horrible arterial, and you can do shopping on your lunch break, and you can meet at the car, and you can go home. And now this was the exact same set of trips as in the previous slide, but with dramatically different results as a result of thinking differently about parking. So it creates the need for half of the parking area, or huge cost savings, about half of the land area, or twice as much economic development opportunity per acre, a quarter of the arterial trips, less than a sixth of the arterial turning movements, and less than a quarter of the vehicle miles traveled, or 4 times as much economic activity per unit of congestion, simply by thinking about parking differently. Other things that you should be thinking about are making sure that you're not allowing more parking than you have roadway capacity to get to that parking. You should also be thinking that if you're requiring 4 housing units for every car, which is what you're doing currently in your zoning code, is that really the burden that you want to place on developers and then complain about traffic congestion? Or should you instead be requiring housing units for people connected with that new development in order to create the best public outcomes? Why does Austin still force developers to build more parking than the market would warrant while you're complaining about traffic congestion and housing affordability? Maybe that's a question for later. In order to make all this work, you've got to be able to measure success. You are clear about what your values are, but your values are no good unless your values are tied to performance metrics. You still look at intersection level of service, which is a measurement, the calculation of average seconds of delay that a car experiences at an intersection in the peak 1 hour as measured off of the peak 15 minutes. And it's done in this very sort of friendly A through F letter grade system, with the implication being, of course, that level service F is failure. No, the intersection, it does not work. Oh, no, it fails. And your city traffic engineer is a personal failure, right, for allowing this failure of the intersection. It's terrible. But let's keep in mind what level service is measuring. So if this is the sort of traffic volume on one of your key corridors, and that's the capacity of the roadway, level service is focusing on that peak 15 minutes to the peak 1 hour. That's what we care about. And we have all of these tools that focus just on that. Really important, ignoring all of the rest of the capacity that we have in the opposite direction and the rest of the day. It would be like if Southwest Airlines bought a new plane every time, their 8 a.m. flight filled. Their business would not work very well. And of course, the result is we build streets like this. This is the best my profession can do. That's level of service A, that's what it looks like. And that's level of service F. So this happens to be the highest grossing retail street in California. This is University Avenue in Palo Alto. It used to have 4 traffic lanes. People in Palo Alto whine a lot about congestion, but they would never widen the street back out to 4 lanes because for them, they recognize that retail sales per square foot is a transportation performance metric that trumps level of service. That what this street, their main street, is really all about is delivering on retail success, not on traffic congestion. So how you look at level of service really depends upon your perspective, with a traffic engineer having a very different perspective than an economist. The economist would say getting to level of service F at the peak 1 hour is optimal. You have correctly sized the infrastructure. If supply and demand come into balance at the peak of the peak, that is exactly the right sized facility. If you had built it any wider, you would be grossly wasting public dollars. Why would you do that? That would be dumb. Other problems with level of service is as we analyze level of service, well, first of all, we're required to estimate sort of the worst case scenario level of vehicle trip generation for development, and then apply, background growth to be, quote, conservative. And then we, calculate out 30 years, and then we calculate out to, 4 decimal points, the exact number of seconds delay that your grandchildren will be facing, like as they drive through that intersection. And going from level service A to D, that's okay. But if your development projects happens to trip a threshold from D to E or from E to F, that's really bad, and you've got to mitigate. And your mitigation, of course, is going to be focused on cars. And again, you're going to be emphasizing the least space-efficient mode of transportation, not caring about the other modes, because, of course, the other modes are the problem, right? In a level service calculation, it's always better to eliminate the crosswalk in order to allow cars to move more quickly. It's always better to eliminate the bike lane or narrow the sidewalk in order to add that triple left turn lane. Score is much, much better, right? Pedestrians are something that are in the way of the free flow of cars. So what do developers do? Well, many of them hire people like me, and we do a lot of math, and we shrink the project to get just beneath that threshold so that they don't trigger a mitigation. That's a lot of what my industry does. Or better yet, we move the project just far enough away that it's outside where the current congestion is. Because we don't have to calculate the fact that the cars are going to be driving all the way back into the core, right? And their trip is going to be twice as long. No, because we're just measuring the intersections immediately around the project. So always better from a traffic or environmental perspective to move the project out to the middle of nowhere. Mostly, though, we're asked to widen the road. And this is great. So we widen the road, put in that triple left turn lane. It's awesome. People can drive fast. But what does this mean? Well, first of all, we haven't solved the congestion problem. We've just moved it to the next intersection down the road. Like we've put the bottleneck was here, it's now over there. No more cars can get through the network. But more importantly, we've made it a lot easier to drive and a lot more difficult to walk or bike or take transit. The primary problem with over-reliance on level of service is that it creates the very problem that it was trying to solve by pretending that we can solve congestion through infrastructure investment. We're actually making it that much easier to drive and that much more difficult to walk or bike or take transit. The worst case scenario level of analysis that we're required to do and then forced to build to accommodate is actually what is creating our traffic problem. We have to have better ways of measuring success. We need to recognize that one thing I cannot do in transportation is solve your congestion problem. What I can do is create public health. What I can do is to create economic prosperity and economic development. What I can do is have a profound impact on social equity in many, many different ways. So tell us in transportation to do the things that we're actually capable of achieving and hold us accountable. But you need to do that by changing the way success is measured and the way that we are rewarded and punished. And what this means, and one of the primary themes of all of your corridor work, indeed all of your governance work, is being very clear about what your values are, and you know that, and to spend the next 3 years ensuring that all of the mechanics of governance are aligned with your values. This is the work that we are doing right now in Oakland, California. And the reason we've been making such tremendously fast progress in Oakland is because we are clear about what our values are. And we're orienting all of our policy and mechanics, and by mechanics I mean traffic signal warrants, right? Down to that level. All of the stuff in your zoning code, right? Your parking requirements are a fundamental tool of your housing affordability goal. So this means starting with values, translating your values into goals, translating your goals into clear objectives that you can know whether you have achieved or not, developing strategies to make sure that those objectives will be met, and assigning responsibility, timeline, and budget to every one of those strategies. It means ensuring that there are performance measurements that can let you see the degree to which you've implemented your objectives, and making sure that the data is readily available and being collected to be able to judge on those performance metrics. It means, most importantly, tying all of this to your budget. If your values, goals, and objectives are not central to your budgeting, again, you're not in the game. And finally, it means taking all of this and reporting back to your policymakers and to your citizens. Because ultimately what we need to do is to build trust. You know, if we're going to ask the voters for money, they need to know that we are spending that money wisely. Think things are bad now. Man, you have no idea where you're going. And that trend, that ship has sailed. You need to be looking very closely at cities like Seattle and San Francisco as cautionary tales to know what is going to happen, and to make sure that one of the foundations of your economy, which is its diversity and the cultural arts that are flourishing here, that you don't let go of those things as you grow and change. And that means having very uncomfortable conversations about defining and quantifying what you mean about equity. Equity can't be a slogan. It's got to be something that has math that backs it up and is tied to your budgeting. And you can see some of the outcomes already. I mean, look at the concentration of African Americans in your city and what is happening to, again, part of the foundation of the amazing culture in here. If you lose that, you are jeopardizing the foundation of your economic engine. Another thing to recognize is that while it may be difficult to halt rent increases and gentrification, you can help to keep your existing communities whole in the face of rising rent by lowering their transportation costs. Why not charge your developers to provide free Capital Metro passes to all of your low-income residents? Why not make sure that every kid has a free bus pass? Why not make it possible for low-income households to shed a car in order to be able to afford an additional $700 a month in rent? It's also going to be really important to look at access to jobs. So you've done well in your downtown, but outside your downtown, you've transit-proofed your employment. How do we take places like this and make it possible for particularly low-income residents to be able to enjoy career opportunity jobs and not have to own extra cars? Thinking about Vision Zero and making a commitment that it is inexcusable that the most dangerous thing that any of us will ever do is to drive a car or walk on the city sidewalks, right? It should be safe for everyone to walk anywhere in this city. So making a commitment to eliminating traffic fatalities and doing the hard work that's necessary to make that happen is important. You've got a great Complete Streets program. It needs to be taken to the next level, and it needs to be implemented. You've got a great plan for transit, but we need to deliver the resources to make sure that in the core corridors, that transit is fast, frequent, and reliable, and really easy to use for people who have a choice of modes. You've got the beginnings of a fantastic public space program in streets. That needs to be scaled up and taken to the neighborhoods and not just a part of the downtown. And very importantly, you all need to play well with others. You do this fairly well, better than most regions, but the depth of the partnership that is going to be required in order to make all this work is far more than you've done before. If you save Capital Metro travel time in your corridors, Capital Metro needs to step it up with delivering increased frequency. And that's going to be a difficult choice for an agency that needs to serve a region, most of which is not designed around transit. And finally, and I would argue probably most importantly, in order to keep this conversation moving and to not just be about slogans and mushiness, you really need to be doing an even better job at collecting and using data to tell a story and to generate trust, as well as to make the very, very difficult trade-off decisions that are going to be necessary in the hard work to come implementing these corridor ideas. And with that, I think, do we still have a little bit of time for questions? How are we doing this time? We're always over. All right, thank you.